So I'm Cindy Murphy. I've been a cop for 30 years since I was 18. I'm also a mother, and somehow it all worked out. I'm not quite sure how, and my child is grown and a wonderful young lady in her own right. But I have loved police work since day one, and it was the right job for me. I was lucky enough to be raised by parents who instilled in me a great deal of confidence mixed with a good deal of competence, and showed me that creativity mixed in with all of that makes the full package. So all I'm saying is we really have come a long ways, and I don't think we should take it for granted ever, especially considering we've only been able to vote since 1920, and we still only make 78 cents on the dollar. So we got to find our value someplace else. Okay, moving on, the investigation. So just a year ago, a little over a year ago, in February of 2014, at 6:11 in the morning, there was a 911 call for a home invasion. A couple called from a Walgreens and said that their house had been broken into and they'd been assaulted. They were newly married. She was 6 months pregnant. He was legally blind, and 6 suspects had entered their house. Actually, 4 had entered their house, but 6 were involved in the end, and had robbed them. And as the investigation went forward, it was revealed that the wife, who was 6 months pregnant, had been sexually assaulted by many of the suspects multiple times, including a pretty brutal anal assault. So this was not a typical investigation for our city. It was extremely violent and seemed to be random because this couple was not involved in drug dealing. They weren't involved in anything where they owed anybody money or were involved in illegal behaviors. They were true victims. The husband is nearly legally blind, as a matter of fact. So they're truly innocent, which is something that doesn't often happen. So officers respond to the residents, and they begin their investigation. They learn the house was ransacked. Valuables, credit cards, money, computer equipment, cell phones were taken. And as the officers are there, they start to hear this argument going on next door in the duplex right next door. And so some of them break off to go next door and see what's happening. And they find out that a woman named Femi, who's a prostitute and a heroin addict, and her boyfriend, Andy, who's a tattoo artist, and the intended victim of this home invasion, are arguing because Andy has looked at his cell phone, which Femi borrowed, and found a text message that bothers him. So this is Femi. Not your usual suspect, right? Anybody notice anything looking at Femi right off the bat? Okay, so she is a hardcore heroin addict, and really what her life is about is finding her next fix. And it really doesn't matter to her how she gets it. It's an awful drug, and it has affected way too many of our families in the world, including my own. So witnesses come forward. There was somebody staying with Femi and the tattoo artist, and he says that they were arguing about a Facebook message, specifically a message where Femi wrote, "What the fuck, you hit the wrong house." Sorry, I just swore. And I will tell you, I am a cop for 30 years. I'm going to swear during this, and there will be a video that's got some swearing in it. But it's a part of the reality I live in, and so I'm sorry if there's anybody who's offended. So Femi was arguing back, saying, "I'm not lying. They weren't supposed to be. They weren't supposed to hit the wrong house, and they weren't supposed to bring 3 people. It was supposed to be 1 guy." And then Andy says he's going to show the Facebook messages to the police, and she grabs for the phone, and they start wrestling and have an argument. And then witnesses helped Andy by pulling Femi away from him because she really didn't want to go to jail. So we have our first phone. It's a Samsung R950, and we get Facebook and call history with family and friends off of that phone really quite easily. Celebrite supported it. There were no issues whatsoever with downloading the phone. And the phone was used to communicate with Mo, who is Femi's drug dealer. And it became apparent through text messages that Femi owed Mo a lot of money. And she then, after officers confronted her at the scene and talked to her about what the statements from the witnesses were, said that she had had a conversation with Mo about how much cash Andy was bringing home in his business, and then she wanted to swing things towards Andy and make him the bad guy and said, you know, there's a lot of tax evasion going on, and he's dealing some drugs, and you know, don't look at me. Look at the intended victim here. He deserved this. So the story that comes out is that Femi and Mo were going to break into Andy's duplex and steal cash. Femi didn't want to do this on her own. She wanted to continue the relationship with Andy. So she and he start planning to have this setup for a home invasion. She says to the police that she called him the night before the attack happened and tried to call the whole thing off, that she had had second thoughts, and that there must be an easier way to get money, but that he hadn't listened to her and had recruited accomplices in order to hit the duplex. She then insists that she has no idea who any of these other people are, and that she thought he would be alone. And interestingly, even though she says she made this phone call, she also left the back door open to the house. She unlocked it. It's a door that is generally always locked. So, so there's some inconsistencies in her story, which is totally not unusual. So from the phone, from the beginning with phone 1, Andy has told us, hey, that's the phone I use for my business. I get over 1,000 calls a day. Okay, well, our intended victim now is looking kind of weird. Does anybody get over 1,000 calls a day? Does anybody know anybody who gets over 1,000 calls a day? He doesn't get over 1,000 calls a day, but that's how busy his tattoo business is, according to him. The cops originally leave that phone with him, and they ask the victim to send screenshots of the conversations on Facebook, which he does, which is a weird way to collect evidence. But you know, again, eventually we got the phone and got it downloaded without issues. But we had this other source of strange phone evidence too. So when he finds out that this was not just a home invasion and people were beat up, but that a woman who was 6 months pregnant was sexually assaulted pretty brutally, he did give us consent to download his phone, but said to us that he needed it right away, which is really a common request of people who give up their phones to law enforcement. It's problematic for us, especially as phones get larger, because we just don't have the personnel or the ability to do phones instantly anymore the way we used to. So this is one of the screenshots that came. Mo hit me up. I think we should do this tonight. He's got over $1,500 in his pocket and doesn't plan on leaving till late tonight. Maybe you could be waiting in the parking lot. Hit us up. I'll scream and whatnot. Play it out. And you can run afterwards towards Hy-Vee. She doesn't look so cute anymore at this point, really. She's pretty desperate. And then she says, well, here's another plan. Let's do it by the Four Seasons car wash. Or by his house. There's no cameras. He lives in a duplex 2 streets behind Four Seasons on East Wash. That seems better. I think it should go down at his house, not at the shop. So she is absolutely and totally involved in this and describes the car. Unfortunately, she never, ever gives an address, right? So she just says, here's generally where the duplex is. And I guess she's hoping that Mo and company will hit the right house. So his answer to her is, okay, when? And then he's asking her to call him. And then we get the message in question. You'll notice 21 minutes ago, so this screenshot was taken really pretty quickly after the assault happened. So there is this message, call me boo, sent 9 hours before the attack happened that sort of indicates that maybe the story that she was telling, that she called him that night and told him to call the whole thing off, might be true. Unfortunately, call records for all of the phones involved didn't show that at all. So while he wanted her to call him, I don't know, maybe to figure out the right address, it's maybe not. It's speculation, but that never happened. So we have to remember, though, that every conversation has two sides. This is really compelling evidence, right? That seems like an open and shut case. But in order to figure out who Mo's accomplices were and to tie him to the communications absolutely, we really needed to get into the phone that Mo had been using. His phone was obtained during a consent search of a girlfriend's apartment, which we found by pinging the victims' phones. So the victims' phones who had been robbed, we set up pings on those phones. They took us right to all of the proceeds of the robbery at the ex-girlfriend's house. Some bad guys are smarter and they turn off phones after they grab them, but not all of them are. So we found the cash, credit cards. The credit cards all are in the name of the victims from the home invasion. So again, this is a case that's coming together really pretty strongly. Victim's wedding ring and those sorts of things, the cash, the credit cards are found on Mo's person. He's arrested for a parole violation and he's interviewed as a witness to the robbery. And he's cooperative for a little bit, says he had the phone that he communicated with for 20 days, and that's all because he had just gotten out of prison 20 days earlier. And he gives the phone number, but nobody ever bothered to ask him for the passcode, which he probably would have given because he was, at that point, talking and sort of minimizing his involvement in this thing and kind of throwing accomplices under the bus as fast as he could. The phone in question is a Nokia 520 Windows Phone 8 device. At the time, totally and completely unsupported by any forensic tool for data extraction. So I said none at all, but we could get media files over MTP. Unfortunately, because the phone was password protected, though, we weren't even able to get that far. Passcode's unknown. We have a now uncooperative owner and a phone that isn't supported by any tools, and a demand for a speedy trial happens soon after that. And it's Mo who's looking for the speedy trial. So at this point, people are coming to me and saying, okay, I need you to get the data out of this phone. I'm looking at them and saying, sorry, I can't do magic. I have done magic in other cases, right? But you have to give me resources if you want magic. And so I put it back on my bosses about how much time and effort they wanted to have put into this case. They decided, based on the nature of the case, that it was important enough that they would throw some resources at this. So this particular phone was sent to Teal Technology because at the time we didn't have any JTAG equipment. We now do. And I've done a few JTAG extractions, but this is probably one we would send out anyway, just based on some of the issues with the phone. So that phone goes out. It cost under $1,000 because Bill Teal was really nice to our police department. I had a conversation with him on the phone, a conversation that I have many times with vendors, in which I said to him, hey, you do us a favor and I'll do you a favor, and the favor I'll do you is whatever I learn about Windows Phone 8, I'm going to share, right? And Bill's like, okay, I know this. And he also knows that unlike folks in federal law enforcement, who in a lot of ways have a lot of advantages, I have one advantage you guys in the feds don't have, and that is I can talk about my cases, right? Like, this is the best thing about being a local cop. I can talk about my cases. I can talk about my cases in detail, and if I have permission, I can share data, right? Like, that's totally awesome. It's unheard of. But it gives me an advantage as an examiner that a lot of other folks don't have, because if I can throw data sets at folks who know how to program and who are developing tools and are looking for that market advantage of having real data sets to work from, I get a lot in return as a law enforcement officer in actually having my cases move forward on unsupported devices. So that's my plug for being a local law enforcement officer. There's a reason I've stayed all these years. So what do we know about Windows Phone? So that phone's out. I'm like, okay, I got to figure out Windows Phone 8 before that phone comes back, because I've got literally less than 6 weeks before there's going to be a trial in this case, which means I need to school myself on what I need to know from a file system perspective. So I go out onto the internet, all the sites I can find, all of the forensic sites. There's a lot about Windows Phone 7. There's not a lot about Windows Phone 8. In fact, the only thing I'm finding about Windows Phone 8 is the documentation from Microsoft. And from a forensic examiner standpoint, we all know that that sort of falls short, right? Like, you're not going to get what you need to know from what's publicly available on Microsoft's site. So what do we know, though? We know that Windows phones are going to have some similarities to PCs. They're going to have a file system, registry files used for settings and preferences, temp files, pagefile.sys, which has been a successful area of evidence for me in the past. I also know, though, from the work I've done with Windows Phone 7 and the research out there, that they use embedded databases, .vol files a lot, as now does Windows 8 for the PC side, and Windows 10 will. The registry format's a little bit different. Some of those registry components aren't used. And the usage artifacts and data retention are different for phones than they are for PCs. Windows Phone 8 and 8.1 also don't use all the same mechanisms as a Windows computer. There's no prefetch file, there's no hyperfill.sys file, no event logs, no shell bags. So those things that are our go-to evidence sources for Windows machines aren't necessarily going to be present in a Windows 8 phone. There's Dave Kovar, the man who kept me out of the fight last night. You missed the story. Sorry, I had to call you out. But I appreciate that you kept me from getting in a fight last night. You may not even remember it. It was wise words you said to me. You know what I'm talking about. So does everyone else. I told the story. So Windows Phone 8 also has the ability to carry a micro SD card. From Windows 7 phones, though, there are some similarities in that the SD card is locked often to the particular device with a key. I have had people say to me that this isn't always true, that they've been able to remove micro SD cards from Windows phones and examine them separately. My experience has always been that those cards won't read outside the phone. So that's why I said in most cases, because that's just what my experience is. When you put a new card into a phone, the OS, the operating system, is going to automatically format the newly inserted card, and it's necessary to acquire the card through the device. Again, if the device is locked, we're not going to have a whole lot of luck with that. Traditional forensic tools won't read the data content stored on the card. Windows won't even recognize it. And if the SD card is removed and you try to use the device, it may not function fully. So there's a lot of interaction between that card and the internal storage of the phone itself. Windows 7 and 8 phones are designed to sync data with the cloud, so I'm looking for other sources of data potentially. What I have, though, is basically a gangbanger who's fresh out of prison and unlikely to be using cloud storage as a solution for his data storage. In this particular case, really this was his communication device. It wasn't that he was using it as a computer aside from Facebook and that sort of app usage. So, but if they had been available, we could have gone to Microsoft SkyDrive or looked for a SharePoint account. That's the sort of thing we'd need to get through a warrant, which would mean we'd need probable cause to get that stuff. So we'd need to know that that was happening. And again, just as a reminder, if you have RF shielded your device, in other words, you've isolated it from the cell phone network, we're not going to see this stuff, and so it's sort of a cart-horse proposition, right? Like, do you know it's synced in the cloud? It's hard to know it's synced in the cloud if you've protected your device because you're not going to see that data. So when we're talking about unlocked Windows 8 phones, we know that we can get to some of the data on the devices through USB. There are various different interfaces to do that. There's the MTP protocol where we can grab music, pictures, videos, and ringtones, which in this case might have been somewhat helpful. There's IP over USB for SDK development. If I had been able to get into the unlocked phone, this might have been a possibility, right? Like just go in as a developer and start attacking it somewhat like we do Androids over ADB. VidStream is an interface that's used on retail devices to allow the phone to mirror its display to a PC. That's not going to do me much good from a forensic standpoint, but it is an option as a USB connection. And then there's this KDNet over USB for debugging and interaction, and this is for registered developers only. This, for me in the future, people who are looking to do some research, that's something to look at, right? Like somebody needs to become a registered developer to play with that KDNet over USB, because I think that there's some potential there for us to get into these devices. This may actually be part of the solution that some of the forensic companies have come up with for acquisition of Windows 8 phones since the time that this case happened a year ago. But if the phone's locked with that USB or with the PIN, or the data connection notification is enabled when it's connected, a lot of these connection options aren't going to work for us. And so I had a locked phone, basically was stuck aside from the JTAG options. There's also the possibility that this phone might be synced to a computer. Again, I'm dealing with a person who doesn't have necessarily a permanent home. There was no information to say he had a PC that this phone might have been synced with, so not enough to get warrants, not enough to do to explore that particular potential evidence source. So what I did know from doing Windows 7 phones is that some of our traditional file system forensics tools work. And if you take 585, the Advanced Smartphone Forensics course that Heather and Lee Cragnell and I have written, you'll see that we spend a lot of time talking about leveraging all the tools in your toolkit, not just sticking to I want to say traditional, but it's really not a tradition yet, right? But not just sticking to the mobile forensic tools, because oftentimes you will actually be able to do more from a functionality standpoint using your traditional file system forensic tools than you will using the other tools. So we'll teach, acquire the data however you can, get as much as you can, and then use whatever tool you have at your disposal to get to what you need. And that's what I try to practice when I'm at work. And I know that there are varying levels of support by mobile forensic tools for Windows 8 phone. And for Windows Phone in general, it's not so good, right? Anybody had to deal with these? It's not so good. The Windows phones are traditionally hard animals from a forensic standpoint. So we talked a little bit about registry analysis on phones. Again, we're going to have registry entries that are stored in Hive files. Active registry files are locked by the operating system. This remains true for Windows Phone 8, and it prevents copying, but some tools can reach out and read the data as it's actively on the device and present that to you in XML format so that you can work with it. This was actually a Parabin first. It's one of the things that I think Parabin did better than other tools early on, and it's maybe their one and only claim to lasting fame. Sorry, that was kind of a dig, but it's not a tool I've had much success with. That doesn't. Maybe I'm using it wrong. It could be user error. But using a remote registry editor, you can get to some of those files, the inactive ones, and work with them as well. So the other thing that I started doing was researching security on these devices, because obviously with a passcode-protected phone, I'm going to need to find a way around that problem. Windows Phone 8 uses trusted boot and code signing to ensure data integrity. It protects against malware and rootkits. Only validated software components can execute. That makes it hard for us from a forensic standpoint if we're looking at bootloaders and that kind of thing. Trusted boot validates firmware images before they are allowed to load the OS, and all binaries must be signed by a trusted authority. And SOC is also used in addition before the devices boot. So they're using some of the same security mechanisms as Windows computers are. They also use encryption. BitLocker technology is used, so it's AES 128, to protect all internal data. Once enabled, the phone automatically begins encrypting internal storage, and encryption key is protected by TPM. And what Microsoft says basically is that if you have a combination of the PIN and BitLocker in place, your data is secure. And so I knew I had at least one of those. The early paperwork on Windows Phone 8 from Microsoft also seemed to indicate that if the phone was password protected, it was also encrypted, but the language was fuzzy. So while it kind of said that, it didn't say at what level, who gets to enable that encryption, whether it's done by an administrator or whether it's done by the user on the device, or where those encryption keys are stored. None of that, that good secret sauce was shared with the public for good reasons, right? Windows Phone 8 supports the use of extended memory on microSD, but only allows for the storage of media files. So if I'm able to get to that microSD card, the only thing I'm getting back is pictures, movies, and music, nothing else. And access to that stored data, as we talked about before, is via MTP, which doesn't work if you're passcode protected. You can tell I'm running against that passcode with every option I look at. The operating system and user and data partitions are encrypted. This is what the Microsoft documentation says. I can tell you that when a PIN is in place, it doesn't necessarily mean that the data is encrypted, because when I got to this phone, it was not. I was expecting to get back from the JTAG extraction a fully encrypted container after reading this documentation, but it was not encrypted. So what they document and what actually happens is not necessarily the same. You can wipe these devices remotely or locally, and if the incorrect PIN is entered too many times, a local wipe is initiated. So I'm not going to start poking on that keypad, hoping to get to the data. Yes? So does the user have to enable that, like on the iPhone, or is that automatically enabled? It is by default enabled. And I think the number of times is 10, but you can change that as the user. So for acquisition support, for Windows 7, our tools are getting a little bit better. There's logical support for images video from external cards by MTP. Contact lists and call logs, the tools all do pretty well with. For file system extraction, there's very limited support by forensic tools. Celebrite, XRY, and Oxygen all claim some level of file system support for Windows 7 and now Windows 8 devices, but again, this was a year ago before they really got to work on this. And when you go in to get that file system extraction that they claim support for, oftentimes it goes through the device, acquires the micro SD card, and tells you, here's your file system extraction, right? Which is the same that we would get with a logical extraction of those items. So for physical extraction, which is what I really needed in this case, JTAG or chip-off are our only options, at least as of a year ago. Celebrite now supports physical acquisition of some Windows Phone 8 devices. Forensic tools may provide some support in decoding and limited parsing of the raw extraction. I can tell you that I had best luck with XRY and NK7 once I got my data extraction from Tealtech. So again, I went back to the traditional forensic tools because the mobile tools were behind. And it's really not a criticism of the mobile tools because it does take them a lot of time to catch up and provide support for especially these phones that aren't the top runners in the market. But it is frustrating because if you're dealing with those phones now, doesn't matter how much of a unicorn is, we need some, some tools to attack it with. I'm not attacking unicorns. I'm really not. That came out wrong. So JTAG extraction. For those who aren't aware of what JTAG is, it's a non-destructive process used to bypass security measures and access the memory of the phone directly. This is just a couple of years ago something that was only being done in a few labs and was extremely expensive. It's now a process that's sort of been democratized so that with an investment of under $5,000 and some training and good problem-solving skills, you can do it in your own lab. So JTAG extraction has really come into its own, and Teal Technologies provides really good training for them, and this is not a sales pitch for them, but they're sort of ahead in that area. So what you do is solder directly to the maintenance ports and draw the data out using software from the developer world, and then you get a raw data dump. And once you get that raw data dump, you have to do the work of rebuilding the file systems and figuring out what's in that data. The Windows Phone 8 operating system is relatively new. It's not in super common use, even now, I would say, especially compared to iOS and Android. And the other thing I would say is that as someone who's tried to develop sets of data from a Windows 8 phone, it's very frustrating from a user interface standpoint still. So I'll get to using it and I'll go, okay, I'm going to build this exercise, and I'll get into the week and I'll go, I'm so frustrated, I'm just going to put that phone away for a while. So it's hard to stick with. So it's kind of clunky from a user interface standpoint. So this is what JTAG looks like. What we're talking about is taking the phone all the way apart, exposing that printed circuit board or PCB, and finding the correct ports to solder leads to. This is a better documented process than it was certainly a couple of years ago, and there are diagrams and things out there available through the trainers and through some other sources. So it's less mysterious than it used to be, and getting less mysterious all the time. Some of the common tools are the RIF box and the ATF box. Both of those provide pretty good support for a lot of models of Windows Phone 8 devices. And if you're looking for a quick setup. I'm not going to play the video, but there are videos out there online that'll walk you through what JTAG looks like. Really, you end up soldering those leads. You connect it to a box. You connect the box to a computer, and you use software to pull it off. They now have a lot of different boxes, jigs, and adapters. Different people have different choices. Bob Elder is always a good person to go to if you're looking for information on JTAG. He's our forensic examiner, investigator of the year, right, this year. But he has a lot of great information and is willing to share with people. So this is what a RIF box looks like. Here is the software interface that goes with the RIF box. There are some things you have to really worry about when you're dealing with this, and it doesn't show in this particular screenshot, but it's as easy to wipe the data off of a phone with the touch of a button as it is to pull the data off of a phone with the touch of a button. So, so really making sure you know what's going to happen before you click on something is important when you're doing JTAG work. This is the ATF box. You'll notice it comes in a slightly different form factor, kind of like a dongle rather than a true box, although it comes in the box form as well, and the software interface. So these are not true forensic tools. These are developer and manufacturer tools that have been sort of co-opted by our community to do phone forensics. Sometimes it's the only way in, though, so it's good. So couple weeks pass, I get my data back. I've got a time clock clicking, right? So I said to you I had about 6 weeks when the data went out. 2 weeks have passed. I now have a month to work with the data. Maggie Gaffney, who works for the Massachusetts State Patrol, is the person who actually did the extraction from my phone. And when she did the extraction, she called me in the middle of it and she said, "This phone is just being a pain in the butt." She said different words than that, but I'll avoid saying them. And she said, I get it started and it stops. I get it started and it stops. By the time she got this started and completed, the actual extraction took 18 hours from beginning to end. So it was not an easy JTAG process for her. But she got me the data. She was persistent. I'm really happy about that. So I get back a raw bin file. It contains the full physical image of the memory from the chip on the phone. If you load these, your forensic tool may or may not parse the file system. And in my case, the forensic tool just sort of, the three I used, just sort of looked at it and said, "I don't know what that is. You'll have to try something else." So Celebrite didn't parse it, Oxygen didn't parse it, and XRY didn't parse it. Xways, however, pulled that data in and said, "Ta-da, here's your file system." And what it gave me back was this. So this is a screenshot. That is 28 partitions, okay? Already looking like a strange animal, right? And you'll notice that the bottom two partitions, it's a little bit light though, but have the vast majority of the data in them. Oh, she's giving me the 5-minute signal. So in this case, I used multiple tools: Xways, Ncase, Celebrite, IEF, database viewers, anything I could, including Python scripting, and the answer is to just dive in and dig. I use a lot of keywords. I use a lot of just parsing through the data, looking for strings, and use that to try to find what I needed to find. Focusing on sort of the mobile-centric kinds of dates and times. And doing that, I was able to find that partition 27 is our system data, 28 is our user data. You'll notice it says 28,069 users. This is Xways. There are not 28,069 users. So you have to question what your tools are telling you. There are, in fact, 25 default users on a base model Windows 8 phone. Your tools can give you misinterpretations of the data. There's 3 important accounts: public, WP comm services, and def apps or predefined apps. User contains multimedia files. In this particular case, that also includes application data, so that's definitely important to my case. WP comm services is where you get all of the phone type information. Store.vol is going to have your phone-based features, SMS, email, contacts. That contacts table has 131 columns in it. It's crazy. Phone, which doesn't have a .vol at the end but is a database file, has your call logs. They're ESE database files and have that standard magic number beginning at the first 4 through 8 bytes. These are the database layouts. You're going to be able to find those on the presentation, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing. So sometimes you get lucky, even if your last name is Murphy. I had a text message in here that says decode 0103. The code for the phone really was 0103. Would I have gotten that with a keyword hit? I would not. Yeah, he's staring unbelievingly, but yes, the code actually was 0103. So I was able to get into this phone and actually take pictures of stuff after I found it and do verification. It was totally awesome. And I want to, Adrian Leong wrote a bunch of scripts to help me through this data. He actually was a visiting scholar for me and was scripting in my lab for me as we were working on this case. And text messages are a little different, but literally the picture of the gun with a message that said, "This is what I'm going to use tomorrow," was in there. What do you think of that? They're in several pieces. You get the references to the different images. And you can see, as you walk through, that the data is stored differently, but you can put it all back together with the original text message. And then I'm gonna go forward through this. You guys will have access to the presentation. But I want to play this video file because it's the smoking gun. So this video was found in the phone. It happened after the time of the assault. You want to play it for me? Because I can't click it from here. Oops. Move forward. There's a lot of swearing. If you click on the picture itself, it'll go. It should go. It went yesterday when we tested it. The presentation gods.
Well, ain't no nigga never bust down in my bedroom. Nigga, motherfucker bust down in this bathroom on this motherfucker floor in that toilet. Nigga, fucking, you know, in this sink, nigga. Fucking talking about.
So a lot of what they're saying here is don't tell anything about it. Don't tell anybody about anything that happened. Or here's what I'm going to do to you. And he's holding a gun when he says the whole thing. This asshole,
a real trap shit.
Happened to the guy that told us what happened at the end. So that all worked out. But literal smoking gun inside the phone that we wouldn't have been able to get into. I'm going to move forward. These guys ended up not going to trial. After the evidence came out of this phone, they all confessed and were recently sentenced. This data set I shared with Celebrite, and that's part of why they're posting Windows. They're able to parse Windows Phone 8 files now. So anyway, thanks to all these folks. They really helped a lot. And sometimes it takes a team to get job done fast. So thanks. Any questions, let me know. Sorry to go over.